Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the final in our Listen Up series with the BOHS and the UK Hearing Conservation Association. Yep, so this is our final webinar focused on managing reproduced sound in a work environment. If you've been before, welcome back. You might hear some stuff you've already heard before, and if not, it'll be myself doing the Q&A logistics in a moment, then over to Claire to do an introduction to what the UKHCA do and what they're about, and then over to Stephen and Tony to take us through our presentation for today. You'll see maybe that that Stephen has Claire Forshaw under his name. It's not Claire 2, it is Stephen, so don't worry about that. So for the Q&A, yeah, so at the end we have some time, so if you want to send in any questions during the webinar or once the presentations are done, we'll run through all the questions, post them to the panelists who will answer them. Any that we don't get round to, we will post the questions to them after the webinar is done, and I will put them in an email with a recording of the webinar, hopefully tomorrow, so you can view it at your own leisure. So without further ado, I will pass you over to Claire to begin the presentation, and I hope you enjoy.
Thanks, Lee, that's great. And thanks everyone for joining us for the 5th in the series. Hope it provides again some more interesting insight into some of the issues related to conserving hearing. Thanks again also to BOHS for hosting us and giving us this platform to speak to you. It's really appreciated, and I hope we can collaborate and work together more in the future. So a bit of an introduction from me. I won't labour the point, because if you've been to any of the previous sessions you will have heard all this before, but just in case you're joining this one as the first, a bit of an introduction to the association itself. It's a not-for-profit charitable association formed with basically like-minded, passionate individuals interested in progressing issues and concerns around conserving people's hearing in the UK. We basically are emulating a model from the States. They have a National Hearing Conservation Association, and at the moment we're made up of a variety of different professionals, other charitable associations, trade bodies. So we have members like health and safety professionals, acousticians, occupational health, occupational hygienists, behavioural interested people, audiologists. So it's really a wide range, and obviously suppliers of services and equipment into this kind of market. So hopefully this is going to progress forward. So we're a group of different multidisciplinary professionals who are passionate about preserving and promoting the protection of our nation's hearing health. At the moment we're in the phase of raising awareness and directing people to good practice and information that's already available, and that's kind of part of what we're doing as part of this process. We've got 5 main areas which we've pretty much covered in our series of webinars previously. So we have special interest groups set up to specifically look at our key areas of interest. So we're looking at hearing conservation at work, hearing conservation at leisure. We acknowledge that educating people, particularly educating young people, is really important in changing attitudes and behaviours, because we feel that noise, in terms of our approach to it, which is why we exist, is probably way behind a lot of other health issues, and that's acknowledging that health is behind a lot of safety issues. So influencing young people in attitudes towards their hearing and their sound exposures is something we're really interested in doing and getting into schools and supporting the information they receive on their hearing and protecting it. And a kind of very bespoke industry when it comes to sound and creating sound is the music and entertainment sector. So we're interested in progressing good practice in that sector, and one that's not on this slide is in design, and we did a webinar on that a couple of weeks ago. But again, from a managing issues point of view, getting in early again, designing spaces and environments for good acoustics and for protecting people's hearing is another important element that we would like to progress. So as I say, why is it a problem? Why do we exist? Because people don't take the hearing seriously. People don't take exposure to noise seriously either. And we talk a lot about hearing loss. A lot of the guidance around managing noise in the workplace is around protecting people's hearing, but it goes much wider than that. And so in educating and raising awareness around the topic, we're trying to sort of, as I say, raise awareness of the other implications of a hearing loss. So the fact that, you know, hearing loss can have a negative impact on social interaction, on confidence, on work ability and income, quality of life, you know, that kind of isolation that having a hearing loss brings with it. Noise exposure in itself has other effects on health, so things like tinnitus, I'm sure you'll all be familiar with, but also it's a stressor, so people's heart rate increases when they're exposed to noise, and it's now been very closely linked to early onset of dementia, which when we talk a lot nowadays of affecting and improving people's mental health, you know, we need to think about how environmental and industrial sound is affecting our cognitive ability over our lifetime exposure. So this is where we are today. We're going to talk, or Stephen is going to talk in a minute about managing reproduced sound. Just a quick kind of recap from me about what has gone before, if you want to catch up, if you've missed any of them. Our first session back some weeks ago now was about noise control. So if you've not watched that one, that will probably be of particular interest to this audience, I'm guessing. But it spoke a lot about how a lot of noise control is actually self-financing, because, you know, if you think about it, noise is created, it's a loss of energy in simple terms. So if things aren't efficient or working as well as they could be, or there's an escape of energy, which is, you know, being manifested noise, then, you know, you're losing money, if you like, in some sense. So if you want to listen into that, that's got some really cheap and effective noise control solutions, and also a perspective from the regulator in that about what they expect on what experience they've had. And we did touch in that one about accessing competent advice for noise control solutions. The second one we did was about health surveillance. Again, looking at the challenges that surround implementing health surveillance and uptake of health surveillance, but introducing some innovative ideas, innovative tests, innovative access to tests for hearing. So new ways of thinking around how do we improve people's access to hearing health surveillance, and using that as part of risk management, and making people more empowered to understand kind of where their hearing is at, so they can protect themselves going forward. The third one was about design, very much how kind of specialists look at environments and design aspects of a space or a building in terms of what its purpose is. So what kind of sound environment do you need, for example, in a classroom or in a hospital as compared to a factory, and the user needs as well. So look at it kind of holistically from not only good noise control, but for good hearing audibility, and for hearing impaired people as well. So might be interesting if you haven't seen that one to look into there. And our last one was 2 weeks ago, which looked at the implications of managing a hearing protection programme. So again, the positives that can bring, but the pitfalls to be aware of, and the experience and evidence that has been gleaned from from the HSC's work and acousticians who've worked in this field for a number of years in terms of managing hearing protection as a one control solution. So as I say, I'm looking to, or as an association, we're looking to work more closely with BOHS in the future. I'd encourage you to have a look, at our website, follow us on Twitter, send me an email at inquiries at, if you'd like to have any more information, please sign up to our newsletter. That's where you can kind of keep up to date. And as I mentioned, the special interest groups, if anybody does have an interest in this area and feel they could link up and work more closely with us, we'd be chuffed to hear from you and collaborate with you and take you into these groups to progress our interests and outreach in these areas. And as I say, we'll be looking to work more closely going forward with BOHS on this subject. So that's all from me. I'll hand over to Stephen. Stephen is one of our directors of the association, and I'm sure he'll make his own introduction as to his experience and interest in this topic and the support he's been given the association to date. So I will hand over to Stephen, and hopefully he can take over the screen and make his presentation.
There we go. I've just handed you the baton there, Stephen. So you should be able to, yep, see your screen there. So just bring the presentation up. Good to go. Oh, you just on mute there, Stephen. Sorry. If you just unmute yourself and then.
Sorry about that.
There we go.
Common fault. Just to confirm, you can actually see that. That's the main thing. Yep,
we can see it. See the presentation. Good to go.
Okay, cool. Right. So good afternoon. My name's Stephen Wheatley. I'm chief exec of a business called Hear Angel Limited. I got into this business a couple of reasons. One, I'm interested in business development, but I've also suffer from hearing loss. I'd also like to introduce my colleague Tony, because he's part of this story. You can see Professor Tony Wright here, who works with us at Hear Angel Limited as our scientific and medical advisor. Tony gave me a hearing test when we first got on with this, and it became clear that I have hearing typical of somebody who's about 15 or 20 years older than I am. I have 8,000 hertz tinnitus, and he surprised me by telling me that I'd used a shotgun quite a lot, and also that I was left-handed. It was like having a hearing test conducted by Sherlock Holmes. It was a bit of a shock. So I understand what it's like to live with hearing impairment. Mine is primarily caused by motorcycling since I was around about 10 years old. After that, quite a bit of Led Zeppelin and quite a lot of shooting. So I suffer quite badly. My hearing is quite a lot older than I am, sadly. And I'm hopefully on a mission to try and help other people avoid the problems that I've got. Okay, so now my screen isn't going to work for some reason. Oh, here we go. Right, okay. So I'm Stephen Wheatley. That's a brief introduction. There's a few credentials there, which Claire has asked me to talk about momentarily. We, Hear Angel Limited, is a contributor to the Senelec Safety Standards Committee, which is responsible for the IEC 62368 safety standards, which is being introduced in December. We're a member of the Hearing Loss and Deafness Alliance. I think there may be some members from that here today. I'm a contributor to the ITU WHO Safety Standards Working Group, which has come out with the safety standards H.870 and 871. I'm also privileged to be a trustee of the UK Hearing Conservation Association, and I'm a member of the WHO's Make Listening Safe campaign committee, and I'm fairly sure there are a couple of members of that committee here also today. So that's a little bit of background. So as well as being interested in this commercially, I'm interested in this from a macro health perspective, in that hearing is my focus and I'm involved where I can be. Claire asked me to say a few words on a couple of these issues. Senelec have issued a new standard 62368-1 which comes into effect for handsets in December of this year, 2020, and it is being reviewed in the lights of the changes of technology, because at the moment most of the focus is on expecting the handsets to provide protection for recreational headphone users. The issue there is that the handset is becoming less and less relevant as we get more and more wireless headphones. But we're there contributing to that standard. We also contribute to the WHO's much more demanding standard H.870, which for those of you in the recreational industry may be aware that Apple have actually adopted. It's now part of their iOS 13 and above health pack. We're involved in that. That is more demanding, and it does include recommendations for wireless headphones. And then at the bottom, the WHO has a Make Listening Safe campaign, which is focused on increasing the awareness of risk in the high risk group, which is defined as the 12 to 35 years of age group. And we are in the planning stages of a global campaign to make people in those age groups aware of the risks to their hearing so they can conserve it. As I mentioned, I'm joined by Professor Tony Wright, who's the Emeritus Professor of Otolaryngology at the University College London. Don't ask me how long it took me to learn to say that, rather a long time. And I have also, I think it's important when one does a presentation of this sort to disclose the level of interest. So our company, Hear Angel Limited, develops technologies that reduce the risk of hearing damage from reproduced sound in occupation and recreational environments and meet the safety regulations and standards. So we do make a living in this space, and I hope you find these few insights valuable and interesting. So let me just start off on the sort of macro health and safety issue. If we went back 25 or 30 years, I think it's likely that this chap here would not be wearing as much PPE as he is. He might be wearing a pair of jeans, a t-shirt and a baseball cap, and he'd be there grinding something at work. And we can see the effects of health and safety at work in as much as, you know, he's wearing a safety visor, he's wearing a dust mask, he's wearing hearing protection, which some of you will probably quite rightly point out he's wearing incorrectly because they clash with the headgear he's wearing. They should be worn vertically, not horizontally. He's wearing gloves, he's wearing knee pads. We can't see, but my estimate would be he's probably wearing steel toe cap boots. So this is what we're looking at, and we would be horrified if we walked into an industrial environment of any sort and saw somebody doing this sort of task without the right sort of PPE on. There is one other thing here. If I was using an angle grinder on that piece of metal, I'd have strapped it down so it didn't fly off, but hey, that's perhaps just me. So we've made terrific progress in providing PPE to people in lots and lots of different situations. But if we, as we will in a moment, look at the situation in a lot of cases to do with reproduced sound, we're probably 30 years behind. I'll come to that shortly. So we know what we're talking about. Let me just define reproduced sound. Reproduced sound is all the sound that's reproduced electronically by the speakers in headphones or headsets. So you generally are subjected to two sets of sounds. There's those sounds that reach your ears without any form of electronic processing or amplification. Reproduced sound is everything else. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at those in the working environment. And we've divided that into two major categories. The first one is headphones, where they have to be worn for work, as in you cannot do your job unless you're wearing headphones. So to save you worrying about it, I've given some examples. So if we compare this outside broadcast camera operator with our highly protected operative with the angle grinder, we're probably looking at what he would have looked like 20 or 30 years ago. So let me talk you through it. So this particular chap is an outside broadcast camera operator, and he's at some form of sporting event. He's wearing a headset because that's how he communicates with the television program director. So, simple question, what is the safe listening period in this situation? That's a question that we must ask ourselves if we're going to protect the hearing of the people we're responsible for correctly. So what is a safe listening period? I'm afraid you can't answer that question without first addressing some other issues. The first one in this case is, what are the ambient noise levels? Now, if he's actually at a horse race track, for example, and he's out on the course somewhere, the ambient noise levels are likely to be quite low. If, however, he's at a Premiership football match, the ambient noise levels are quite high. If he's at a Premiership football match, which is a derby, in my case between perhaps Arsenal and Tottenham, or in Claire's case between Liverpool and Everton, the ambient noise is going to be very high for the whole event. So what is the ambient noise? And that ambient noise is only that noise that would have hit his ear were he not wearing headphones. So we have another measure which we call residual ambient noise. So we've done quite a lot of work with the BBC, who take this problem seriously, and I can assure you this is not a BBC cameraman. The BBC estimate in some Premiership football grounds the noise levels can go to 102 to 104 when there's an incident. And what happens is, at the point there's an incident, that's when the director is instructing the cameraman precisely what he wants them to do. So that's the moment at which the operator has to have the best clarity of conversation with the director. And I suspect what he will have done is he will have turned the feed to his headphones to a very high level. That residual ambient changes throughout a game of Premiership football. But there are other cases. He might well be a cameraman who does Premiership rugby. Some of their grounds are very old, and some of the camera positions are well within the crowd. So you get a much higher level of ambient sound, ambient noise, and therefore much higher levels of residual ambient. So you'd have to do assessments on what this person is receiving frequently throughout the day that or at the period he's working. So because of the residual ambient, he then has to have a listening level, and the listening level is for the reproduced sound. So how loud is he listening to the director? Again, from working with the BBC, they have done measurements on this, and it is between 6 and 10 dB above the residual ambient. So let me just give you a brief example. Let's say that we're at a Premiership football match and the ambient noise is 98 dB. He's getting 6 dB of occlusion from those on-ear headsets. He won't get much more. So what did I say? 98, 92. And then he's having to listen at perhaps 10 dB above that level. So he could be listening to the director at around 102 dB. And the reason it's between 6 and 10 is it depends what you're trying to listen to compared with what is creating the ambient noise. So in a football ground, for example, a rugby ground, the noise is generally created by human voice. So the frequencies are similar to those frequencies you're listening for. So you need more clarity. So his listening level, even optimistically, is going to be in the very high 90 dBs, could easily be in the very low hundreds, at which point he's probably, given the content which we're going to look at, he's probably got somewhere around about 25 to 30 minutes potentially of listening. Is there a risk of transient sound, so splats and feedback and things like that? I don't know whether you know, but a lot of stadia are pre-wired. The broadcasters turn up, plug their cameras and their communication systems into ports which are installed in the stadiums, and they put the truck on the other end of it and they start their broadcasting. In some of the big stadiums, there could be 14 or 20 different locations. Each of those locations has the potential to feed back to some of the others. So yes, he's not totally in control of the sound he's going to experience. He could get a howl round, he could get feedback, he could get a transient. So we need to consider that. So how long is he going to listen? Well, it doesn't sound like very long, does it? I'm going to televise a football match. So you're going to be there for 2 periods of 45 minutes. You might be asked by the broadcaster, you might be required to do some pitch effect stuff beforehand. So probably 2.5, 3 hours possibly on the camera. And we said the listening time could be as little as half an hour, but we don't know. The program material, we do quite well with this on this particular example because the program material is human speech and it is relatively low energy compared with something like electronic dance music. But with all those variables, what is the safe listening period? That's a question that we have to consider, and it's very difficult to come up with a definitive answer. So let's change the game. We're now talking about a sound engineer. And this sound engineer could be in all sorts of different roles. So it could be in an advertising agency, could be mastering a film score, he could be laying down tracks for a pop record. There are all sorts of things he could be doing. He could be editing a podcast. So he's using his headset and he's listening to program material. But what's the safe listening period? Is there any ambient noise? In this particular example, I don't believe there is, because it looks to me like he's in probably a soundproof studio. So very little ambient noise, and therefore very little residual ambient noise driving up the level in his headphones. But what level is he listening at? We know that sound engineers and monitoring engineers, because they're obsessed with sound, are very meticulous, and they want to listen sometimes at very high levels to try and find out if there's any interference on the track or any artifacts they need to get rid of. But he's completely in control of what level he listens at. So he can listen as loud as he likes, unless we do something to try and protect him. Risk of transient sounds. At day one at sound engineering school, they say when you skip between feeds, you should always put that feed back to 0. I don't know how many of them actually do that. I suspect not very many at all. And it is not uncommon to click from one source to another and find that there is some interference or a howl round on the source you've just clicked to. And that is very, very unpleasant. How long do they listen? Well, this guy could quite easily sit here at his desk, 3 or 4 hours at a time, twice a day, perhaps, depending on the urgency of what he's trying to do. So in this case, the length of time would be very important in trying to calculate what the risks are to this person. Program material, well, if it's speech, if it's a podcast, it's relatively low energy. But what if it's a soundtrack for a film, or he could be editing the soundtrack for a computer game? They're very, very high energy. He could be editing an electronic dance music track, and that is one of the most highly compressed that you can get and would absorb his daily sound allowance, the safe listening exposure, very quickly. So given all those variants, what is the safe listening period? What is it now? We don't know. Another example, a pilot using his headset to communicate with air traffic control and his crew. What's the safe listening period? Ambient noise? Yes. Many of you may know Dr. Mike Lower, who's at the ISVR in Southampton, did a lot of work on this, him and his students traveling across the Atlantic in British Airways aircrafts of different types to try and work this out. And yes, there's a lot of ambient noise because it's wind noise on the nose of the aircraft. If it's a rotary wing aircraft, like a helicopter, you've got another problem because some of that ambient noise, while the aircraft doesn't go very quickly, the engine is generally inside a helicopter with you. It's above the pilot's head. So you've got high levels of ambient noise. So what's the residual ambient? The headphones that this pilot are wearing are very similar to the ones that we saw our cameraman wearing. They can probably be expected to reduce the ambient by around about 6 dB. So he can be listening, he's going to get quite a high level residual ambient. Listening level, don't know, but what we do know is it's likely to be 6 or 10 dBs above the background noise. The good news here, it's probably likely to be nearer 6 than 10 because the background noise is wind noise and not coming from humans. So, but we don't know what his listening level is. The risk of transients, We're told by pilots that air traffic control output is not normalized. So when you are in transit, you get handed from one air traffic control sector to another, and when you do so, you quite often find that they're at different levels. Sometimes they're lower levels, others they're much, much higher, and you have to adjust your volume settings. So it may not be a transient, it just might be a very loud radio transmission from the air traffic control. How long do they listen? Well, that's another question. So if you think about a long haul flight, say maybe 6 or 8 hours going somewhere like Las Vegas, you're going to spend a lot of time communicating at the beginning of the flight, and then on the end of the flight. So probably an hour and a half or so at the beginning, and similarly at the end. But once you're airborne, you may well have a long period of time when you're just doing operations normal type calls. But if you're doing a short haul flight, I suspect when you take off from somewhere like Stansted to go to Amsterdam, you're probably on your communications all the trip, because as soon as you leave the ground in Stansted, you'll be talking to the air traffic controllers in Amsterdam. And the answer to the question is we just don't know because of the pattern of work. And what's the program material? Well, we're fortunate again, in the main, it's going to be, in fact, it's always going to be speech. What's the safe listening period? We don't know. Something you may all be familiar with is contact center call centers. What's the safe listening period? Low levels of ambient noise relatively, because they're working in offices. Residual ambient will be very low. Listening levels could be okay, don't know, but those headsets have their own independent volume control, so the agent can turn it up to whatever they want it to be. Risk of transients, not generally from the equipment, but sometimes from the people they're talking to. We've spoken with people in call centers who've had whistles blown at them down telephones. I don't think I want to ever imagine how painful that could be. So there is a risk, and they should be protected against transients. How long do they listen? Could be working 8-hour days working on a headset. Program material, again, relatively low energy content, being speech. But what is the safe listening period? We don't know. Finally, the headphones at work. So this is where the headphones aren't actually required to do the job that the person is doing, but they are using headphones at work. And you see this quite commonly. Most commonly is in an open plan office. People are using headphones to isolate themselves or listen to their own content. What's the safe listening period? Ambient noise, relatively low. Residual ambient probably shouldn't be problematic. Might be, but I don't suspect it will be. Listening level, don't know, because the user is entirely in control of what level they listen at. Risk of transients, probably not, because they're probably listening to something that's coming to them, in this particular case by Bluetooth, or they're listening using their phone or an iPad or something like that. So the risk of transients is probably quite small. How long they listen? They could be listening all day. You could get into work and you could theoretically spend your entire day at your desk with a pair of headphones on. Probably more likely you listen half the day. Program material, they might be listening to podcasts, but conversely, they could be listening to electronic dance music. And if they are, they will very, very rapidly use up their sound exposure that is safe. But what is the safe listening period? We don't know. And finally, this is an example. This is an example which has just become much more popular and much more prevalent, is people working from home. And they're working from home and they're using headphones to make calls or listen to their own content. So what is the safe listening period? We don't know. What is the ambient noise? We don't know. It might be quite low if they're at home, but a lot of people are choosing to go out to internet cafes and places like that to get better bandwidth, where they probably do have to wear headphones. So what is residual ambient? We don't know. So therefore, what is the safe listening period? What are the listening levels? Again, they're completely in control of the listening level. So we don't know what that listening level is. Risk of transients? Again, quite small because they're probably using, in this case, is using a Mac or a phone or something of that nature. But how long do they listen? Conceivably for very long periods of time. Program material, we don't know. We know what they're listening to when they're making phone calls because they're listening to speech, but they could be listening to electronic dance music for 6 hours a day while they're working for you. We need to think about that, and we need to try and work out what is the safe listening period now. So there are other considerations as well. Clearly, we don't have a separate pair of ears that we use when we go to work, and we have one pair of ears which get used in other ways as well. And in London particularly, I don't want to be southeast centric, but we did some work on the London Underground, and people commuting can quite conceivably have used up their sound exposure for a day in 40 or 45 minutes traveling on the tube, listening to music. They then turn up in your business and spend 6 hours in an open plan office listening to headphones again, and then have a repeat dose listening to headphones on their way home. Gaming. I know people who work in environments where they're giving lots of hearing protection, and then they go home and spend 3 hours gaming. Live events, clubbing. I know these aren't directly our issue in terms of protecting the employee, but we need to consider them because they are increasing the risk to the employee. And then there's perhaps a risk to the employer, because if that employee does have hearing damage, I suspect they're going to go to their employer and try and say, I experienced the hearing damage here. We need to address this. So how do we assess these risks, and how can we reliably manage them? It's a vexed question, but I think we're probably perhaps 20 years or so behind the photograph I showed you earlier of the man with all his PPE. The examples that I've given you are all examples that we have come across and do come across frequently. That's the formal part of the presentation complete. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you for that, Stephen. If anybody has any questions, on the right hand side you should have a questions box or a chat box to type into if you want to send any of your questions in, and we can ask Stephen and Tony. So just give it a moment. We did have one in actually beforehand, saying about, can we get a copy of the presentations to share with all the delegates with the recording? Are we okay to get those sent over? Excellent.
Yes.
Yeah. So those will be sent over this week then with the recording. Just wait to see if there's any other questions come through.
You stunned them.
Well, I hope not. I didn't mean to stun them. It is a really complex. It's a really complex issue, and you know, some of the people, you know, we've spent a great deal of time with several broadcasters who've gone to a huge amount of trouble and some expense to protect their staff properly. And I'll keep mentioning the BBC because they're probably the best example of the lot. But we've been to others and they've seen what has been done at the BBC and others and simply done nothing. And I really don't know how they can do it. I've been to a football ground where I've seen a Premiership commentator who you'd all probably recognise remove his hearing aids before putting his headphones on. Now, yeah, the reason he probably has hearing aids is because he's been a football commentator for 15 years. That is ludicrous. You know, this chap is 10, 15 years younger than me, and he's functionally deaf. And it's horrible. Tony, you're on.
We've got we do have one question in now. So is there a way to do noise dosimetry at here with headsets?
That's
Sorry.
Stephen.
Yeah, of course. Okay. I have deliberately not talked about the sort of products that we have developed, because I thought it was much more of a sort of inquisitive, make people think about the issues. But to answer your question, if people have personal issue headphones, there are we do have, and this, I won't be shy, I've got one in my hand, we do have an individual headphone decimeter which has a plug on one end and a socket on the other, and you put that between you and the source, and it makes sure that you are not overexposed according to the regulations. So it matches the noise at work regs. It also has a absolute hard stop limiter at 118 dB, and anything above 118 is brought to 100 in less than half a second. And that was designed with the help of the BBC, and it has no effect on the sound quality, though it does change the volume if it has to.
We've got another question in here. Have you seen any improvements in the headset tech over the years that have lowered the risk of acoustic shock?
Can I do that? And then, so I think we need to be very careful. Acoustic shock is a bit of a trip hazard, because the terminology means that that sound, the acoustic bit, has caused a shock in somebody. And the problem with it is it's very, very subjective. Acoustic shock has been used for all sorts of things, and it's why I didn't use it in the presentation. That's why we use transients, because those transients may or may not cause acoustic shock in the recipient. There are some, you can, I just described one of the features of the HDM product is that it has a peak level absolute hard stop limit. Still pretty loud, but it's only loud for less than half a second, so it starts off high and decays quickly. We can also provide hard stop limiters set at different levels for different applications. So, for example, in the interview studios in the BBC, where the headphones are all shared, so you get a politician who's going to come in and talk on perhaps, say, Radio 4's Today programme. They'll put a pair of headphones on, and those headphones will not go above the limit level that the BBC have set, regardless of what you pump into them. Did you want to say anything about acoustic shock, Tony?
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Tony Wright. I'm the Emeritus Professor of Otolaryngology at UCLA Institute. And I spent my life with my colleagues looking at, amongst other things, hearing and hearing damage from a variety of sources, including noise. I agree with Stephen completely that acoustic shock is not a very good, helpful term, because it's not really defined. You can define it however you want. But in terms of acoustic damage, there is blast damage from, for example, the IED in Afghanistan. There's a huge transient output of energy with an up and down phase of pressure, which can wreck the eardrum and damage the little bones and damage the hearing as well. So surprisingly, blast damage in the Indian-Pakistan War of 1965, the Sikh soldiers who were wearing turbans never got blast damage. It was the baffle effect of the turbans prevented the blast damage, but allowed them to hear. So that's one form of acoustic shock. People like saying that going to a disco or a loud concert, and when you come out and you've got some sight, hearing loss and tinnitus, you call that acoustic shock. That usually wears off, and that occurs because of the prolonged exposure to sound tires out the sensory cells, the hair cells of the inner ear. They have a limited energy capacity, and if you stress them too much with sound, they stop working for a while. And then if you're lucky, recover over the next 24 or 48 hours. So that's another form of acoustic shock. However, if the shock is large enough or long enough, then it will cause damage from which the hair cells will not recover with time. Is that enough?
And yeah, but this, you know, there's, as we just outlined, there's been a lot of discussion about what acoustic shock is. I think what we need to do is try and protect people against transients, because they're very unpleasant of any sort. Whether they suffer acoustic shock from them or not is really that only they can tell us. Unfortunately, we're not delivering in reproduced sound. We're not delivering levels anywhere near the sort of levels that the troops would be experiencing in an explosion, fortunately. But still, you know, you're sitting in your office and somebody blows a whistle down the phone at your headset. That would be very, very unpleasant and probably quite upsetting, I'd have thought. And there are ways that we can protect against that. And indeed, there are already call centres probably are more advanced than most of the sectors that we just talked about, because a lot of work's been done in that space.
Well, we do have a question around call centres. So do headsets in call centres not require a device to avoid shocks? And if so, does this not minimise the risk of hearing loss?
I think you would need to do that. I think all responsible call centre operators would have technologies that did what the question has suggested. However, not all call centres are built equal, and some will not. You know, that's what I said. You go back to the point I made right at the beginning. We'd all be shocked if we saw somebody doing that bit of grinding without all that sort of protective gear on. You know, there are lots and lots of call centres out there that aren't providing anything like the protection that they probably ought to be doing. You know, this is a sort of hidden battle in many ways. You know, why is the BBC going to all the trouble it is to protect its staff? It's done all the risk assessment, looked at all the solutions, and it's now protecting them. And you can go to a very, very similar operation, no names, no pack drill, that don't do it. Why? Have they got people with ears which have different qualities, or do they have to adhere to a different set of regulations? Find it very curious.
And then I've got another one here for you. Is there any data on noise cancelling headsets and how effective they are to reduce residual noise?
It's a very good question. It's one that we're spending a lot of time on in our recreational space, because the wish list for headphones and earbuds going forward is going to be wireless, automatic noise cancelling, hearing optimization and safeguarding. They seem to be the 4 key features. As to the effectiveness, I can tell you what it does to the. Yeah, I can give you some information. So we conducted some trials on the London Underground, which is renowned for being very noisy. We did this over the same piece of track at the same time of day to make sure it was equal. So it was in a section from Highgate to East Finchley, which is quite noisy, and we went back and did it several times. What happens is the noise cancelling appears to reduce the residual ambient by at least half, and maybe even a bit more. So that's really, you know, so that'd be taking 3 dBs off, or maybe even more. It also depends what the frequencies are of the ambient, because noise cancelling is generally better at the higher frequencies and less good at the lower frequencies, though the lower frequencies are less harmful. So yeah, the thing to do if you want to listen, if you want to preserve your hearing and listen for a long time, is get yourself some noise cancelling headphones and have a hearing optimization feature in them, which adapts the sound that you're receiving so that whatever your personal receptors receive, are working as effectively as possible, and you can then generally listen at 3 dBs lower again. So the combination of those two is very effective, and we're seeing a convergence of this consumer technology coming towards the occupational space as well. But we need to protect the people of the hearing of the people who are using the headphones.
Thank you. We've got a follow-up to the noise dosimetry question. Following up on the noise dosimetry, would this account for ambient noise as well?
At the present moment, what the dosimetry is based on is capturing the exposure from reproduced sound. And the exposure due to reproduced sound, the volume you're listening at, is predicated by the residual ambient. And if you think about it, you've got the reproduced sound is going to have to be 6 or 9 dBs, 6 or 10 dBs more than the residual ambient. And so the major contribution to your dose is from the program material reproduced sound, not from the residual ambient.
Okay, so we got enough time for 2 more questions. The last 2 I've got on my list so far.
Okay.
Is the Department of Trade and Industry specification 85/013 still valid, and does it protect call centre workers?
I think the other Claire should answer that question if she knows the answer.
Oh, you just Claire.
On mute.
Oh, yeah, I can't hear you. Sorry.
Was given enough time to think about the answer, isn't it? We can't hear you, Claire.
No, it doesn't say she's muted, so should be able to hear.
Okay, we've lost her.
Ah.
If I can answer while Claire's trying to get back on, it's not a number that comes to my mind immediately. We take our guidance from the noise at work regulations.
We got any luck now, Claire, for your microphone? No, it's still muted, unfortunately. We've got 1 more question anyway, and then we can come back to it, see if it's the technical ground has gone away. There is significant evidence that the protection factors assigned to HPDs by the HSE do not reflect real-world experiences as they come loose, and people themselves respond to HPDs in various ways. Should we be looking at whether protection factors are sufficient, or do they need re-examining in light of real-world experiences? So a bit of a mouthful there.
Right, so HPD being what, hearing protection devices?
I presume so, yeah, it's not been specified.
My learned friend in Liverpool is nodding, or near Liverpool. The Liverpool supporting learned friend is nodding. I think there's a whole education piece about using your PPE properly. I don't know about you, but it makes me smile when I go, if you remember those days when you used to get on aeroplanes, and I remember walking across the apron to an aircraft, I don't know, Stansted or Luton or somewhere like that, and this airplane, whatever it was, an Airbus 320's whizzing away, the generator's going, there's all sorts of other stuff going on, and there's some guy there with a pair of hearing protection devices, probably several £100, if not more, nicely jacked up on the side of his head, standing next to the generator engine on an Airbus. And you just go, you really can't help some people, can you? So I think we need to educate people to use the kit properly. I mean, I'm really disappointed about what I saw at live events. We did some experiments in the outside broadcast area, for example. Helicopter cans with passive noise cancelling were really effective because they're taking down the ambient noise by probably the thick end of 20, maybe a little bit more dB, and it made the whole thing work better. But yeah, if you don't wear it properly, I'm afraid that does make it very much more difficult.
So that's the last of the questions. I don't know if we can hear you yet, Claire. No, sorry. No, we can always add your notes into the email I'll send out with the recording of the webinar. So that is all the questions done. So is there anything else that either of you'd like to add, Stephen or Tony?
Just one little items is that everyone's thought that when you get below about 87 dB, there's no noise damage. In fact, if you carry on sound exposure below 87 dB with enough time, and long enough time, there is damage. There is accumulated damage, even though it's below 87 dB. The quieter it is, the better you are in terms of hearing preservation.
Yeah, I would concur with Tony. Some of the numbers that have been looked at within the World Health Organization were suggesting a recommended target of below 80 dBA for 8 hours.
Sorry. 9. I meant 79.
Sorry, that's gone all very squiggly. I think the Wi-Fi has probably had enough, as well as the audience. Yeah, so the World Health Organization looked at that, but the problem is that if the World Health Organization, what we want to do is to reinforce the messages about hearing safety so that people look after their hearing and make sure it lasts them longer. That's what we have to do. And at the moment, very large numbers of people are being told at work that 85 dBA over 8 hours, is the way forward. If that was going to change to 80, then everybody should change in step, rather than one group saying 85 or one group saying 80. But the point that Tony makes is absolutely right. There are people who are, there are percentages of the population who are quite vulnerable to sounds in that area. They're not safe. It's just that happens to be the regulations that we're working to today. Yeah, what worries me most, just to conclude, is the combined doses that people can now get. I'm talking at the moment to a number of people who are making wireless earbuds. I don't know whether you've seen these, you probably have. They're quite remarkable things. Their ambition is to make sure that you wear them all day, every day. So you put them in when you get out of bed in the morning, and you take them out when you go to bed at night, and they're going to control all sorts of biometrics with them as well. So they'll have heart rate monitors in them, blood pressure monitors. They're talking about whether they can do diabetes, insulin, sugar sensing, and amazing, and be transformational for people who suffer with any of these conditions. And their ambition is to get you to wear them every day, all day. You just think about the combined load that you would have. We've alluded to it there. I can give you examples of people who turn up on a Monday morning at 9 o'clock in an open plan office, and they have already received the complete sound dose they should have done for that one day before they even start work. And by the end of the first day, they've had the whole week's exposure. What worries me is that they'll come back and they'll blame their employer for that. And I think it's up to the employers and the risk managers to say, we have to take steps to make sure that if that happens, we can say you didn't get it from us. You got it from playing games. You got it from going to football matches. You got it from going clubbing, because we took precautions. While you were with us, we took precautions and we discharged our responsibility. But I do worry about, the sort of exposure levels people are going to get. Our hearing just is not designed to take it. That's the problem. Anyway, enough from me.
No, but that brings us to 3:01, so a good time to wrap up. So thank you, Stephen, thank you, Tony, for joining us for your presentations today, and thank you, Claire, for all the work you've done over the last few months to bring this series together. They'll all be up on the BOHS website and the BOHS YouTube channel, I'm sure, on the UKHCA website shortly. So if you've missed any, do feel free to have a look, as well as the presentations, which we'll aim to upload as well. So you can completely catch up on the previous 4 presentations. So I will say to everyone, have a good afternoon, and hopefully we'll speak to you in the future.
Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.